The world of reality television had never seen anything like this before. For years, audiences tuned in to watch the ups and downs of one of America's most unusual families, the Browns, led by patriarch Kody Brown. The family had captured the attention of millions with their show Sister Wives. Some saw them as brave, some saw them as strange, and others saw them as defiant. But nobody thought that their family soap would someday make it into an actual courtroom. And when the news burst onto every news medium, the shock could not be avoided. Kody Brown and his wives hauled into court for polygamy. Viewers who had seen the show from the start could barely believe what they were seeing. To them, Kody was not a criminal. He was a dad of 18, a man forever trying to manage the craziness of 4 wives, dozens of kids, and the constant bickering and love affairs that filled their home. To people, the Brown family was messy, complex, and at times even tiresome, but they were authentic. They were individuals attempting to build a life together in a manner that broke the mold. And to the state of Utah, Kody Brown was something else again. A man violating the law in public view. The problem wasn't television entertainment any longer. It was the law. Utah's close bigamy law had stood on the statute books for more than a century, aimed at criminalizing those who sought to live in plural marriage. Although Kody legally had only one wife on paper, the state of Arizona saw that he presented 3 other women as his wives and cohabited with them as a family, and that was enough to prompt prosecutors to move against them. The Brown family's mere existence was now a criminal offense in the state's eyes, and soon, a courtroom would be the arena where their destiny would be determined. The shockwave was instantaneous. In the streets outside the courthouse, crowds accumulated. Some arrived bearing signs of encouragement, yelling slogans such as "Love should be free" and "Families deserve choice." Others arrived with anger, carrying placards stating "One man, one wife, and stop polygamy now." It wasn't a trial anymore. It was a war on culture. Within their home, the Browns could feel the pressure mounting with each succeeding hour. The wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, sat huddled in hushed discussions, debating how far the state would push. Their kids, some too young to comprehend, asked why journalists were parked at their community. Older children scrolled through social media, reading nasty statements that called their family immoral or illegal. The Browns had endured criticism for years, but this was not like before. This was not gossip. This was the law that came after them. Kody himself was agitated. Usually self-assured, outspoken, and even boastful on TV, he now found himself walking back and forth at night, going over each choice that he had made. Should they ever have agreed to do the show? Was their honesty about plural marriage the exact thing that invited this storm into their lives? He reminded himself that they had wished to live honestly, that they wanted to present the world with the reality that their way of life was not abuse or cover-up, but of faith and choice. But the truth was evident. Their honesty placed a bull's eye on their backs. As the court date drew closer, tension grew heavier. News anchors across the country debated the case nightly. Legal experts asked whether Utah's laws could truly stand in the modern age. Religious freedom advocates defended the Browns, while conservative voices warned that allowing plural marriage would unravel the very definition of family. The debate had gone national, and the Browns were at the center of it. At dawn on the day of the first hearing, the courthouse was ringed by flashing cameras and reporters yelling questions. Kody and his wives trudged up the courthouse stairs side by side, hand in hand, their eyes wan but resolute. Kody wore a black suit, his hair pulled back off his face, his jaw clenched firmly. In back of him trailed Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, attempting to hold up under the blinding flashes of cameras. One journalist screamed, "Mr. Brown, are you going to prison?" Another one screamed, "Do you regret appearing on the show?" Kody did not respond. He simply walked on, the burden of the country bearing down on him. To his kids watching at home, the sight of their dad surrounded by reporters was horrifying and unreal. Within the courtroom, the tension was palpable. Reporters occupied every seat, pens poised. Activists packed the corridors, some praying, some chanting, some simply waiting to witness history being made. When the judge walked in, the room went mute. Every eye was on the man at the center of it all, Kody Brown. As the hearing opened, Kody's name was read aloud. To hear it in that frosty official tone gave him the shudders. He glanced over the courtroom, beyond the smooth wooden benches, to the prosecutors who were developing their cases. These were not individuals discussing concepts. These individuals were here to convince a court that he was a criminal, that his household, his wives, his lifestyle was illegal. For the Browns, it was near impossible to comprehend. For years they had laughed, cried, and eaten meals together in front of the camera. They had navigated through jealousy, new additions to the family, and endless changes within their complex household. But none of those obstacles compared to this moment, because now it wasn't just about their relationships or feelings. It was about whether the government could force them to be separated. As the judge read out the charges, the room went quiet. Fraud? No. Violence? No. Theft? No. The offense with which they stood accused was something much less common. The state charged Kody Brown with bigamy, not on account of paperwork, but on account of the manner in which he lived. The state said that his open acceptance of plural marriage was in direct contravention of the law, and in case the court ruled in favor of the prosecution, it could be catastrophic. Kody sat in silence, fists curled in his hands, as the words rang out in the room. For all his brashness in interviews and all his bravado in front of cameras, he felt stung by the reduction of a man to an accusation of a crime. To the world, he was a husband and father attempting to raise a large family. To the law, he was now a man who had the temerity to challenge the rules of marriage itself. The wives looked at each other with nervous hands clasped together. Their futures hung in the balance of whatever judgment was to be rendered from this trial. Would they be separated? Would Kody be punished? Would the government strip them of the ability to live together as they had for decades? None of them had any idea. What they did know was that the battle was only beginning. This wasn't another TV show storyline. This was for real, and the outcome of this war could alter not just their lives, but the lives of countless other families who lived in the terror of being criminalized for loving more than one human being. The shockwave that started with a headline was now resonating in every corner of America, and with the first day of court drawing to a close, this much was certain: the Brown family were no longer mere reality TV fare. They were at the eye of a legal storm that would push the very limits of faith, freedom, and family in America. The Brown family had grown accustomed to being watched. For years, cameras trailed after them into their homes, into their fights, even into their dinner tables. But having millions of people watch them on a reality show was nothing compared to the intense gaze of prosecutors, judges, and strangers in the courtroom waiting to see them tumble. The courtroom was already abuzz before the Browns even entered. On one side of the room, journalists had their notebooks open, poised to jot down every phrase. On the other side, local activists huddled together, some shaking their heads in dismay, others nodding in quiet understanding. Outside the courthouse, protesters remained, still holding signs, their voices ringing in the walls, some demanding freedom of religion, others demanding strict enforcement of the law. It wasn't so much a straightforward legal hearing as it was a trial of the soul of American family values. When Kody Brown walked into the courtroom with his wives trailing behind him, every head turned. He attempted to appear confident, but there was no disguising the weight that was bearing down on his shoulders. His wives, Mary, Janelle, Christine, and Robin, followed in close procession, their gazes scrunched up, each aware that they were being publicly judged not only as individuals, but as a symbolic unit of something greater. They weren't merely women to many in the crowd, they were sister wives, living testaments of a life that had been speculated upon, maligned, and argued about over the course of centuries. The judge brought the room to order, and the prosecutor stood up to address them. His tone was firm, crisp, and authoritative. He did not dally in depicting the Browns as evil. "Ladies and gentlemen," he started, "this is not a case about faith. This is not a case about love. This is a case about the law. And the law here is unambiguous. Polygamy is illegal. For decades, individuals have attempted to bend this law, but today, this family has publicly defied it before an audience of millions of Americans on TV. If the law is to have any meaning, it must mean that nobody is above the law. not even those who obtain fame and wealth at their expense. Gasp filled the air. The prosecutor went on, driving home point after point. He talked of Kody presenting several women as his wives on national television. He talked of the children growing up in a home where it was normal to live in a household that the state considered criminal. He contended that letting the Browns go on unchecked would be granting permission slips to every polygamist in the nation. Kody sat rigidly, his jaw locked, but he would not turn away. He had anticipated this, he had braced himself. But to hear his life boiled down to bullet points in a prosecutor's summation still hurt. His wives looked at each other with apprehensive glances. Christine biting down on her lip, Robin fighting back tears. This was not merely a legal case to them. This was their family, their kids, their whole lifestyle being stripped of dignity and used as proof of criminal activity. When the prosecutor finally took a seat, the atmosphere was heavy with anticipation. Then it was the defense. Kody's attorney, steady and measured, stood up and addressed the courtroom. He started not in terms of law, but in terms of narrative. He talked of Kody in his youth, attracted to a religion that practiced plural marriage. He talked of the wives, women who had entered voluntarily into these unions, not with coercion, but with belief and choice. He talked of their children, cherished and nurtured, brought up not in hiding but in openness. These people, the attorney declared firmly, are not hiding. They are not criminals. They are individuals who have had the courage to live as who they really are, even if it means enduring mockery. The state tries to make you think that love, when multiplied, is a crime. But where is the harm? Where is the abuse? Where is the victim? There is no one. This law is not one of protection. It is one of punishment for difference. And we will demonstrate it. The words hung in the air like a spark. The courtroom supporters nodded, some of them even smiling in relief. For the first time that day, the Browns felt a glimmer of hope. Kody's attorney wasn't defending them. He was narrating their story in a way that positioned them not as criminals but as pioneers, as a family fighting for freedom. But the drama was not yet finished. The prosecution wasn't going to settle for general statements. They came equipped with evidence. The sister wives' clips were projected on a screen, revealing Kody introducing each of his wives as members of his family. Moments of them celebrating birthdays, moving into new homes and grappling with the realities of plural marriage now played like a reel of confessions. What was once intended as entertainment was now being employed as evidence of guilt. Others in the courtroom laughed bitterly at the irony. The same cameras that had made the Browns celebrities were now the ammunition being employed against them. Every smile, every family outing, every reference to the word faith and unity, was distorted into proof of defiance. Kody sat there, having to watch his own life shown back at him as if it were an exposé. His children laughing, his wives fighting, his own speeches on family and religion, all now used as courtroom fodder. He could sense his blood pressure rising, but he remained quiet. He knew that one anger explosion could destroy everything. The judge observed intently, writing down notes. The seriousness of the case was not lost on him. This was not about any one family. It was about whether or not an outdated law could hold up in a contemporary world. Everyone present could sense it. This trial was history in the making. As the day went on, the Browns sat in silence, hearing strangers analyze their lives. Both wives had their own fears. Mary worried whether the kids would be bullied at school. Janelle worried about her job. Would bosses view her as unreliable due to this case? Christine feared the family was being split up, that Kody was being taken from them. Robin, the new wife, was afraid that taking on the family had brought down even more criticism upon them. And yet, even with the fear, there was a peculiar resilience. When they gazed at each other around the room, they were aware of one fact: no matter what resulted from this court proceeding, they were together. And that bond, that solidarity, was precisely the aspect the prosecutor wished to criminalize. And it only made them more resolute to hold fast. By the end of the day, the courtroom was slowly emptied, but the tension remained. Outside, there were still cameras waiting to capture reactions. The Browns were cheered as they walked out, arms around each other, heads held high in spite of the uncertainty that lay before them. Shouts of insults were hurled by critics, their voices joining the chants of those demanding freedom. For the Browns, it was just the start. The trial had exposed what was at risk, not only their family, but the right of anyone to be outside the law's tightly drawn definition of marriage. The family on trial wasn't merely defending themselves. They were fighting for an idea. And as they got into their car, bathed in flashing lights and yelling voices, they knew the fight had just started. When the moment finally arrived for Kody Brown to testify, the courtroom was so still that even the soft whir of the overhead lights sounded raucous. All eyes were on him as he made his way slowly to the witness chair. For years, millions had watched him talk on TV, laughing, bickering, and explaining his unorthodox family to a fascinated public. But this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't about fun. This time, each word had the potential to design the destiny of his wives, his kids, and his whole lifestyle. He sat down, shifted the microphone, and gazed out across the faces of the crowd waiting for him. Reporters poised with pens, their eyes eager to capture each word. Wives, a row together in the front, watched with a mixture of fear and pride. His kids weren't present, too heavy a burden for their young shoulders, but he sensed them with him. He drew breath, steady voice but thick with emotion. "I would like to begin by saying this," he started, gazing around the room. "I am not a criminal, I am a husband, I am a father, and I am a man who has lived his life based on his faith. I am here because of love, not due to crime." The words resonated, hard and purposeful. A few individuals in the room nodded. Others shifted uncomfortably, not wanting to believe what they were hearing. The prosecutor leaned back, arms crossed, his face unreadable. Kody went on, his voice increasing in intensity as he talked. "When I made the decision to live plural marriage, I didn't do it to hurt anyone. I didn't do it to disobey the law. I did it because of my faith. I did it because I was called to live this way. My wives all joined us willingly. There was no force, no pressure, only choice. We created this family with love and trust, and for the state to declare us criminals, merely because we prefer to share our lives in a different way, it's wrong." As he talked, images of his life flashed before him. His first wife by his side during the early years when funds were low, and there were only a few at home. Janelle, who joined later, and brought balance and stability. Christine, who was a bringer of laughter and warmth. And Robin, the last to arrive, who'd brought him fresh vitality and fresh challenges. Every wife was unique, but every one of them had chosen him, and in their company, he had created something to be proud of. He addressed the judge once more. "Your Honor, I understand what others talk about concerning polygamy. I've heard all the slurs. I've read the posts on the internet. People believe that it's all about control, about abuse, about exploiting women. That is not my family. My wives are not weak women. They make their own choices, they speak their own minds, and believe me, they tell me when I'm wrong. If anyone has ever watched our show, they know, I don't control this family. Half the time, I'm just trying to keep up." A ripple of laughter ran through the courtroom. Even the judge allowed the faintest smile. But beneath the humor was something deeper. Kody was showing that their family wasn't a shadowy cult hidden away in the desert. They were real people with real struggles, visible for all to see. The prosecutor rose and approached, prepared to confront him. "Mr. Brown," he stated, his tone piercing, "you acknowledge here today, under oath to present 4 women as your wives. You acknowledge that you cohabitate as one household, referring to yourselves as a polygamist family. Is that what you do?" Kody didn't blink. "Yes, that's correct." The prosecutor jumped at it. "And you acknowledge that this way of life is shared publicly on national television, viewed by millions?" "Yes," Kody answered. "Then you acknowledge that you are breaking the law. This is not a matter of your personal faith. This is about your public behavior. The law does not allow bigamy, and you are practicing it openly." The courtroom hummed with murmurs. It was the argument the prosecution had been building toward all along. The Browns weren't ordinary citizens peacefully exercising their religion. They were celebrities broadcasting it to the world. Kody leaned forward, his voice consistent but resolute. "I agree that we live openly. Yes. But what I do not agree on is that love can be illegal. I do not acknowledge that the government can tell me who I can marry as my wife. Legally, I have one wife. Spiritually, I have four. That is my business. And it hurts no one. If being truthful about who we are is a crime, then the real question isn't with me. It's whether there is freedom in this country or not. The subsequent silence was thick. Fans in the back row of the courtroom looked at one another, some being moved to tears. Even polygamy's critics couldn't deny that his words had power. For an instant, the courtroom wasn't a trial. It was a moral argument over what was acceptable under the banner of personal freedom. The prosecutor pushed once more. Mr. Brown, do you not admit that by living in this fashion you are setting an example before others to violate the law? Do you not admit that your children are being brought up in a household that disobeys the laws of the state? Kody hesitated, his eyes growing gentle. My children, he replied slowly, are being brought up in a home where there is love. They're learning responsibility, trust, and respect. They understand that not everybody will agree with our decisions, but they also understand the importance of honesty. I'd rather have my children watch their father live honestly than cower in fear. If that's rebellion, then so be it. But I'll never instruct my children to be embarrassed by love. Those words cut through the room. The wives, who were sitting mere feet away, gripped each other's hands tightly, struggling to keep from weeping. For them, this was not a matter of legality. It was a matter of dignity. Their lives, their marriages, their children's futures, were all being weighed in this cold, bright courtroom. The judge heard intently, making notes, but his face gave nothing away. The gravitas of Kody's testimony hung in the air long after he left the stand. He had not only defended himself, he had made the trial a question of freedom, of choice, and of what constitutes family. Outside the courthouse doors, the world was already responding. News correspondents played his words on the night report. Followers inundated social media with supportive messages for his bravery. Critics, though, sensed arrogance, labeling him reckless to even equate his family's decisions with fundamental freedoms. The country was polarized, but nobody could refute this. Kody Brown had spoken, and the people were listening. As he left the courtroom with his wives in tow, the cameras pursued doggedly. Journalists yelled, microphones pressed into his face. Kody, do you think you'll win this case? Kody, do you regret exposing your family to the public? Kody, are you afraid of going to jail? He paused for a moment, his wives crowding around him, and said loudly enough that all could hear. This isn't about me. This is about every family ever who felt like they had to be ashamed of who they were, because the law wouldn't welcome them. Today I represented my family. Tomorrow I hope for others as well. The flashes broke out. Reporters yelled follow-ups, and the Browns got into their car and were gone into the sea of voices and lights. In the car, the stillness was thick, each wife grappling with the day on her own terms. Christine dried her eyes, Mary sat impassive, Janelle leaned against the window, and Robin breathed quietly as if not to break the silence. Finally Kody exhaled. That was only the beginning, he said softly. But whatever happens, we told our truth. And in that moment, the family knew, whatever the verdict, whatever the outcome, they had refused to be silenced. Their voices, once confined to reality TV, now echoed in the halls of justice. And for the Browns, that alone was a victory worth fighting for. The courtroom was still abuzz with Kody Brown's testimony when the prosecutor stood again, now more determined than ever. He wasn't going to allow Kody's words to go unchallenged. To him, Kody was not a representation of faith or liberty. He was a man knowingly breaking the law, and now was the time to establish it. The prosecutor adjusted his tie, picked up his stack of papers, and strode to the middle of the courtroom with the assurance of a man about to strike. He started in a voice that rang well through the room. Ladies and gentlemen, let's not get carried away by flowery words about freedom and love. Let us deal with the facts. The facts are straightforward. This man, Kody Brown, has paraded 4 women as his wives. He has built a public image as a polygamist, flaunting the law of the state on national television. And no matter how much he dresses it up in religious language, the law remains the law. The words were biting, slicing through the air like knife blades. The wives were immobile, gazing straight ahead, their knuckles white as they gripped one another's hands. Mary did not dare react. Christine blinked back tears to prevent them from falling, while Janelle and Robin sat stiffly, hearing their marriages broken down to evidence of crime. The prosecutor raised a DVD case overhead, then waved it in the judge's direction. "This, Your Honor, is the state's most incriminating piece of evidence, their own television show." He opened it with a snap, and seconds later, a large screen glowed to life at the front of the courtroom. And there they were, the smiling faces of the Brown family, the opening credits to Sister Wives. Music floated on, and then footage rolled, Kody standing in front of each woman and announcing her as his wife, the kids playing across the yard, the family sitting down to eat, weddings and holidays. Laughter on the screen, but in court, the mood was solemn. "This," the prosecutor went on, gesturing toward the screen, "isn't fiction. This isn't a scripted television show. This is a man standing in front of millions of people, proclaiming his plural marriages. And this, Your Honor, is the definition of bigamy that our state statute states. He's admitted it, he's advocated it, and now he has to pay the price." The Browns sat, their stomachs churning. What had once been a means of sharing their tale, of making their life ordinary, was now a weapon against them. Every laugh, every smile, every beaming claim of family harmony was distorted into an acknowledgement of wrongdoing. Kody's fists curled beneath the table as visions of his children poured across the screen. They were loved and raised, but look at them now, their pictures utilized to condemn their father. The prosecutor did not leave it at that. He brought forth witnesses who decried the practice of polygamy, experts who averred that it promoted inequality and harm. They testified of other instances, of societies in which polygamy had been associated with abuse and exploitation. Even though the Browns had never been accused of such offenses, the prosecutor tarred them with the same brush. "Polygamy is more than one man and his wives," one witness asserted. "It is a system that has historically resulted in harm. It is a breeding ground for exploitation, and when the Browns put it on television, they send a message to many others that this lifestyle is okay." The defense protested that the testimony was irrelevant to the Browns' case, but to no avail. The damage was done. The words hung in the air, sowing seeds of doubt. The prosecutor continued, his voice becoming more aggressive. He strode up and down the courtroom, never taking his eyes off the judge. "This family is not innocent. They are not victims of arcane legislation. They are deliberate lawbreakers who set out to gain notoriety and wealth by profiting from their illegal lifestyle. They knew the law, and they set out to violate it, challenging the state to act. Well, today the state acts. Today we say enough." The wives shifted uncomfortably, the indictment on their motives cutting deeper than any law ever could. Fame and riches. That's not why they had opened their lives. They'd done it to demonstrate that plural families can live without hiding, without harm. But now that decision was being framed as a mistake, distorted into proof of arrogance. At last, the prosecutor directed his attention back to Kody. His tone lowered, more blunt, nearly intimate. "Mr. Brown, you sit here asserting love and faith as your defense. But the law is not a matter of your emotions. The law is a matter of order. And the law dictates that what you are doing is against the law. You can sanctify it with religious jargon, but you are not exempt from the laws that compel every member of the state. Do you dispute that?" Kody glared at him, his lips set in a hard line. For once, he did not reply. Not because he could not think of anything to say, but because he recognized that the prosecutor was not posing a question. Instead, he was making a statement intended to resonate in the judge's mind. The room was heavy with silence until the prosecutor took a step back to his table and banged his pile of papers down. "No one is above the law," he declared. "Not even Kody Brown." The judge requested a recess, his gavel clashing against the desk. The room exploded in whispers as individuals stood, stretching cramped legs and whispering furiously about what they'd seen. Journalists hurried to write hasty updates, their headlines already in place. Prosecutor dismantles Kody Brown's defense. The Browns stood together silently as the courtroom emptied for a recess. Robin wiped her own eyes, whispering that it seemed like the whole world was against them. Christine grumbled under her breath about how unjust it was to be likened to abusive polygamous cults they had no resemblance to. Janelle, practical as always, reminded them that this was what they had anticipated. The state was going to do everything in their power to take them down. And Mary, taut and silent, simply gazed at the blank screen that had just flashed their lives on the screen in a crime series. Kody finally broke the silence, his tone low but firm. They can spin our tale whichever way they might choose. But nevertheless, it remains our tale. And it is the truth. The recess was over, and the family steeled themselves as the gavel reconvened the court. The prosecutor had delivered his punches, and all could sense the force of his assault. The Browns had lived their lives openly, hoping that honesty would serve them. Honesty had been made into a weapon, however, and the state had fired each round. It had. Whether the defense would be able to recover from that barrage was yet to be determined. But one thing was sure: the war had only intensified. And as the Browns returned to their seats, meeting the icy stare of the prosecutor, they realized the struggle for their family was far from over. The courtroom had become charged, weighed down with the bite of the prosecutor's attack. The Browns sat in a row at their table, battered but not broken. The judge's face revealed nothing, his eyes fixed, his face impassive. The prosecution had tried to depict Kody Brown as a lawbreaker, a man showing off his defiance to the world. They had taken his own life, his own show, and used it against him. And for a moment, it seemed like the weight of the law was crushing down on the Brown family. But now, it was time for the defense. Kody's lawyer, a stern but wry man with a talent for flipping arguments on their heads, rose to his feet slowly. His voice was not raised, yet it had a quiet authority that drew people in to hear him. He pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, briefly looked at Kody and the wives, then addressed the judge. "Your Honor," he started, "we've heard a great deal of talk about laws. We've heard of bigamy. We've heard of what the state believes this family symbolizes. But today I'd like us to talk about something more basic, something greater than codes and statutes. This case isn't so much about whether or not Kody Brown violated a law. This case is about whether or not the government can insert themselves into private lives that do nobody any harm." The words hung in the air like a challenge. Writers furiously scribbled in their notebooks. The wives sat up straight in their chairs, hope lighting in their faces. The lawyer strolled over to the screen upon which the prosecutor had played earlier clips of sister wives. He pointed at the frozen photo of the smiling Brown family. "This is what the prosecution refers to as proof of a crime. Study it well. Do you see an instance of fraud? Do you see abuse? Do you see exploitation? No. What you see is a family. You see parents raising children, husbands and wives living life together, people making the choice to live honestly." He faced the judge again, his tone hardening. "The prosecution would like you to think that love, because it doesn't belong in neat little boxes of one man, one woman, is a criminal act. But let's be clear. Kody Brown only has one legal wife. The other women are spiritual wives. By choice, not by coercion. There are no forged documents, no counterfeit marriages, nothing that breaks the legal framework of this state. What the Browns do have is a personal religious agreement. And if the government can criminalize that, then what's next? Do we criminalize unmarried couples who refer to each other as husband and wife? Will we criminalize individuals who form families in non-traditional means? Where does the intrusion stop?" The judge shifted marginally. His pen tapped against the pad of paper in front of him. The attorney had touched a nerve, moving from legality to freedom. The attorney continued. "Your Honor, the state is not present today because this family harmed anyone. They are here because this family was honest about who they are. If the Browns had concealed, if they had fibbed, no one would stand today, because they were brave enough to live openly, because they were brave enough to declare, 'This is who we are.' They were brought to court. That is not justice. That is punishment for telling the truth." A murmur passed through the gallery. Even some who opposed polygamy couldn't help but agree with logic. The defense next called their first witness, a professor of religious freedom and constitutional law. Gray-haired and quiet, the man stood before the court and started to discuss how polygamy laws were anachronisms. "These laws were enacted in the 1800s, he explained, when legislatures were driven by fear and prejudice against certain religious groups. Times have changed. Our society today sees diverse families, single parents, homosexual couples, blended families. Yet here we are, clinging to outdated laws that target people simply for how they choose to structure their private lives. The prosecutor protested on grounds of irrelevance, but the judge let it stand. The professor went on, his voice firm. If the government is able to enter this family's living room and inform them they are not a family, then where does individual freedom cease? This isn't about condoning polygamy, it is about acknowledging that the state has no right to punish consenting adults for how they live. The defense lawyer let the words linger in the air before nodding at the witness in appreciation. He knew the evidence had fallen just as planned. Then he redirected his attention to Kody. "Here, Mr. Brown," he said, leading him again to the witness stand. "I want to ask you simply, has any woman in your family ever had to marry you?" "No," Kody said resolutely. "Have any of your wives been held against their will, forced or mistreated?" "Absolutely not. They can leave at any time if they want to." "And do your children feel loved, taken care of and secure in your home?" Kody's tone softened. "You misspeak sudden." "They do. They're my world." The lawyer addressed the judge. "You misspeak. There you have it. The Browns are not criminals. They are not frauds. They are not a threat. They are a family, unconventional, yes, but still a family. In this case, Your Honor, is about whether we will preserve the right of families to be, or whether we will punish them for having the audacity to be different." The prosecution bristled, standing to cross-examine. "Mr. Brown, you insist time and again that your family is not like others we've heard about in the media. But can you say that some polygamous groups have been associated with abuse and harm?" Kody stared straight at him. "I don't dispute it, but those are not my family's decisions. We don't live in compounds. We don't arrange marriages. We don't operate in obscurity. Judge us for what we do, not for what others do." Speak setting. The Shishan to lump all polygamists into one. But the Browns are not those individuals. They are people with their own tale, and they should be judged on their own merit. The defense concluded their case with one last ardent remark. "Your Honor, this trial isn't about safeguarding society. It is all about penalizing one family because they are in the spotlight. If this family just kept quiet, if they kept in hiding, none of this would be taking place. But rather than hide, they lived openly. And because of that, they are being made to stand trial as criminals." Speaks Genin, that is not justice. That is discrimination. And this court is capable of stopping it. When he took his seat, the Browns could sense a change in the atmosphere. For the first time, they were not merely playing defense, they were going on the attack. They had made the trial a contest of ideas about freedom, about the boundaries of government authority, about what it really meant to be an American. As the courtroom cleared at day's end, the Browns exited as a unit, hands touching briefly in wordless solidarity. Reporters closed in, but this time the headlines were altered. "Defense turns case into fight for liberty." The world outside was as sharply divided as it had been previously. But the Browns now possessed something they hadn't had during the trial: momentum. Within the family vehicle, Christine smiled weakly, the first such smile she had been able to muster in days. "For once I think they looked at us," she murmured. Robin nodded, continuing, "Perhaps this will be different." Janelle peered out the window, weighing the far distance still before them, while Mary merely breathed. "We needed that." And Kody, with a moment of silence, finally said something. "We retaliated today. Now let's see if it was enough." The trial wasn't finished. The judge hadn't given his verdict. But one thing was for sure: the Browns were no longer simply on defense. They were fighting back. And the struggle for their family's destiny had become something far greater than any one of them. Outside of the courthouse, the trial of Kody Brown and his wives had already spilled out beyond the walls of the courtroom. What had started as a legal fight over polygamy had become a national debate, and before long the whole country seemed to be divided down the middle. TV networks broadcast round-the-clock coverage. Social media sites erupted with hashtags. Talk shows weighed whether the Browns were initiators of family liberty or irresponsible lawbreakers that were ripping apart the fabric of tradition. For Browns themselves, Each step through the courthouse door was like stepping onto a stage. Flashing cameras, yelling reporters, supporters waving signs that read "Family is freedom" and "Love shouldn't be illegal." Within feet of them, protesters held up their own signs. "One man, one woman, stop polygamy now, and the law is the law." The sidewalk outside the courthouse was a war zone of opinions. And the Browns were in the middle of it all. Late at night, the nation's news anchors picked apart every last detail. Some felt for the Browns, applauding their bravery to live openly. Others criticized them, saying that to permit polygamy could unravel the very institution of marriage. A commentator leaned forward on a prime-time debate and said, "This is not about one family. This is about whether America is going to redefine marriage again. And if we say yes to polygamy, where does it stop?" At the same time, online discussion boards flared with controversy. In one corner, allies posted messages of support. "Love is love. Adults have the right to decide. The Browns are not hurting anyone." In the other corner, opponents came back with "This is against the law. These were aware of the law. If we allow one family to defy rules, what of order?" Some discussions turned nasty, with strangers abusing each other, using vitriolic language, their words as harsh as swords. But aside from the tweets and hashtags, there were real people impacted. Families throughout the United States who lived in secret plural marriage followed the trial with heart-pounding intensity. For decades they had hidden in fear of losing their children or being prosecuted for telling the truth. Now, for the first time, they saw their lives reflected in the public arena. Some hoped perhaps the Browns' situation would grant them protection. Others feared, if the Browns lost, the persecution of families like theirs could become even tougher. Even within the Browns' own large family, the rift was deep. Some kin provided interviews in support of them, stating the family was loving, generous, and misunderstood. Others kept their distance, not wanting to be associated with the fearer. "We love them," one cousin acknowledged on camera, "but we don't agree with the decisions. And we don't believe the law should be broken for them just because they're on TV." The wives felt the weight of it all. Christine confessed privately that she hated being compared to cult-like groups in the news. "We're not like them," she whispered one night at home, tears streaming down her face. "But it feels like no one cares about the difference. They just see us as polygamists and nothing more." Janelle, the most level-headed, tried to reassure her. "The ones that count know the truth. And if enough people can see us for who we are, it could change things." Robin fought too. The youngest of the wives, she was always described as the bad girl, the one who broke the family by coming on board later. "I feel like the villain in every headline," she confessed. Mary, usually aloof, surprised her by grasping her hand and speaking softly. "They'll paint us however they want, but we know who we are." Even their kids weren't safe from the storm. Teens scrolled through social media and witnessed their family made fun of with memes. Their father roasted on late-night TV shows. Some friends stood by them in school. Others shunned them altogether, not wanting to get caught up in the backlash. For younger children, it was bewildering. They couldn't comprehend why people who didn't even know them despised their family so terribly. Within the courtroom, the Browns attempted to shut it out, but the chasm outside permeated. Journalists murmured news of public sentiment during recess. Lawyers sensed the weight of winning a case, but also defining a cultural moment. No longer was this a trial. It was a referendum on family in America. As the week went on, the split hardened. Politicians opined. A few lawmakers openly advocated tougher enforcement of anti-polygamy legislation, claiming that softening them would lead to pandemonium. Others suggested perhaps the rules needed to be rethought. "We've transformed in the past," one senator told a morning TV show. "We once banned interracial marriage. We once banned gay marriage. Perhaps this is just the next step." His comments made headlines and sparked hope and indignation. Leaders of the church got into the fray too. Some branded the Browns sinful and risky in their lifestyle. Others called for mercy, stating the government had no business intruding in private homes if no one was hurt. Sermons were rewritten in churches nationwide. Dinner table conversations were heated, and families who had never known the Browns now found themselves debating polygamy over coffee. At home in the Browns' house, the family sat around the TV late at night viewing the non-stop coverage. They switched it off sometimes, tired of the din. Other times, they couldn't tear their eyes away. They witnessed themselves being portrayed as villains, one moment and heroes the next. It was a whirl, a weariness, and a terror. Kody often sat quietly during those moments, his jaw clenched, his eyes fixed on the screen. Finally one night, he stood and shut the television off mid-broadcast. "Enough," he said firmly. "We can't control what they say about us. We can only control what we do in that courtroom. That's where the truth matters." The wives nodded, but their faces reflected how much the outside world mattered to them. They understood that the nation's opinion could determine the judge's ruling. Public opinion was not the law, but it tended to guide it. Meanwhile, the media frenzy only intensified. Protesters outside the courthouse began camping overnight, turning the street into a round-the-clock spectacle. Supporters sang songs and prayed together. Opponents shouted chants, demanding the Browns be punished. At times the tension nearly boiled over, with police stepping in to keep the two sides from clashing. Each morning, as the Browns entered the courthouse, they had to walk through that gauntlet of voices, some yelling blessings, others spewing curses. For the children who sometimes accompanied them, it was frightening. For the wives, it was exhausting. But to Kody, it became motivation. "Look at them," he breathed one morning to his lawyer. "Half of them despise us. Half of them adore us. Either way, they're talking about us. We can't allow this moment to be wasted." Behind closed doors, the trial continued. But in the great outdoors, the nation was deliberating. The Browns had been turned into symbols, willingly or not. To some, they were evidence that family love was diverse. To others, they were a danger to all that marriage represented. The country was divided, the debates louder by the day, and as the courtroom struggles went on, one thing was certain: whatever the judge's ruling would be, it would not only determine the Browns' destiny, it would ripple outward, influencing laws, fueling debates, and polarizing communities all over the nation. For better or for worse, the Browns saga had become America's saga. Kakar. The courtroom grew heavier by the day. The arguments had been presented, the witnesses summoned, the evidence laid out. Now only the waiting remained. The Browns sat at their table, their faces etched with fatigue, their nerves worn thin. The trial had dragged their private lives into the brightest glare, and a single man in a black robe soon would rule whether those lives were illegal. The air was charged as the judge flipped through his notes. Reporters occupied the benches, their pens in reserve, their cameras prepared to record the slightest hint of emotion. Protesters and supporters overflowed the gallery, their silence strained, waiting to boil at the first provocation. All were bated breath, awaiting the signal that the verdict was about to come. But first came the closing statements, the last opportunity for both sides to present their case. The prosecutor rose to his feet, voice firm and relentless. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case was never about love. It was never about choice. It is about the law. And the law is clear. Bigamy and polygamy are illegal in this state. Mr. Brown has confessed, again and again, that he has 4 wives in his household. He has confessed that he introduces them as such, publicly on TV, without remorse. He was aware of the law. He decided to challenge it. And today, this court has to send a message that nobody is above the law." His words rang out like a hammer against steel. He spun around to the Browns, his finger held aloft in accusation. "If we let this slide, if we let one family disregard the rules, because they just so happen to have a camera crew trailing behind them, then we are not a nation of laws. We are a nation of exceptions. And exceptions create chaos. I beg of you, Your Honor, to enforce the law. Find this man guilty." The gallery buzzed with mutters. Supporters shook their heads, lips clamped in outrage. Protesters nodded, pleased with the bite of his words. The judge brought up a hand for quiet, and the court became still once more. Now the defense had their turn. Kody's lawyer stood up slowly, fiddling with his glasses, his serene demeanor a contrast to the blaze of the prosecutor. He approached the podium, his voice softer but purposeful, compelling the room to huddle in closer. "Your Honor, the prosecution wishes you to think this is an easy case. They wish for you to view this as black and white, law and crime. But life isn't usually that. This case isn't about chaos. It is about freedom. It is about whether or not the state has the ability to reach into a family's living room and label their love a crime. He walked toward the Browns' table, pausing to rest a hand lightly on the chair behind Mary. These women are not victims. They are not coerced. They are not hidden away in some secret compound. They are here in this courtroom, proudly standing beside the man they chose. Their children are healthy, loved and raised with care. This is not exploitation. This is not fraud. This is not abuse. This is a family. The wives blinked away tears, their shoulders straightening under the gentle weight of his words. The lawyer's voice grew louder. The prosecution has presented you with video clips, headlines, opinions. But what they have not presented to you is a single act of harm, not one, because there is none. And in America, we do not punish people for the lack of harm. We do not punish people for being different. We punish crimes. And loving more than one person is not a crime. It is a choice. He pivoted abruptly back to the judge. Your Honor, this family has already paid dearly. They've had to suffer ridicule, intimidation, and humiliation at having their personal lives exposed in public court. Don't make them pay the price of being labeled criminals for having the courage to be honest about who they are. Let them walk out of this courtroom free, not for themselves, but for every family who feels they ought to have the right to live without fear. There was a silence after that which was like a vacuum. Even the whir of the air conditioning seemed to be sucked away. The Browns were seated in frozen stillness, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a physical burden they could hardly bear. The judge cleared his throat, his expression unemotional. This court will reconvene tomorrow for the verdict, he stated bluntly. His gavel came down, and in an instant, the day was over. But beyond the courthouse, the waiting had already started. Masses amassed, sleeping on the sidewalks, intent on being present when history was created. Some held candles and prayed for the freedom of the Browns. Others yelled through bullhorns, calling for justice and retribution. The street was a living mirror of the country's divide, hope and rage crashing in a tempest of voices. News channels televised live, counting down the hours to the verdict. Will the Browns be allowed to walk free? Or will this be the day the law finally catches up to the Browns? One announcer queried in dramatic tones. Opinion polls flashed on the screen, with a nation divided right down the middle. Half wished the Browns would be left alone. Half wished the law would be enforced. And in the middle were millions, undecided, who watched the drama play out. In their house that evening, the Browns all congregated in the living room. The wives huddled together, the kids in bed upstairs, not knowing the entirety of the burden their parents bore. Kody remained by the window, gazing out into the darkness, his own reflection gazing back at him, as if he himself were a man torn between worlds. Christine spoke first, breaking the hush. Do you think we're going to lose? Her voice was barely above a whisper, almost delicate. Kody spun around, his expression strained. I don't know, he confessed. But one way or another we've already left our stamp. They can't take that away from us. They can't take away the fact that we stood. Robin extended his hand, her voice shaking. But the children? What does this mean for them? If she couldn't bring herself to say it, the weight of the thought was too much. Mary broke in, firm and surprising all of them. Whatever it is, we'll deal with it. We've survived tougher times than this. We hold together. That's what we do. Her words calmed them, even if only temporarily. Janelle spoke softly too. Tomorrow it's in the hands of the heavens. All we can do now is pray. The room was quiet once more. Outside, the sounds of protesters filtered thinly through the walls. Shouts, horns, a world holding its breath along with them. The following morning, as the Browns entered the courthouse, the atmosphere was one unlike any they had ever seen. The crowd overnight had doubled, pouring into the street. News trucks occupied the block. Police lined the street to separate the two groups. Supporters cheered as the family passed, while opponents booed and hurled insults. The Browns stood tall, hands brushing together for support as they entered. The courtroom was full to capacity. All seats occupied, all eyes fixed on the family. The judge presided at the bench, his face as inscrutable as always. The atmosphere was so charged with expectation that even breathing seemed a strain. The Browns sat down. Attorneys muttered final words. The judge rustled papers, Then, with a voice both steady and weighed, he announced the words everyone had long awaited. This court is prepared to render its verdict. The courtroom fell completely silent. And in that suspended moment of breathlessness, the Browns' whole universe teetered, between freedom and punishment, between acceptance and condemnation, between history and heartbreak. The whole courtroom was breathless, as the judge stood to give his word. Reporters hunched forward, pens quivering in their hands. Supporters grasped each other tightly in prayer. Protesters were crushed against the glass outside, trying to catch every sound. The Browns sat in silence, hands clasped together under the table, pounding hearts like drums. The judge straightened his glasses, his gaze scanning the room before resting on the family. His tone was quiet, deliberate, but with authority. This case has evoked passions, within and beyond this courtroom. He started, it's raised questions on freedom, family, and the extent of the law. My responsibility, however, is not to reply to popular debates. My responsibility is to apply the law as it's written. Every word was a blade cutting through the silence. Kody felt Mary's hand grip his tighter. Christine bit her lip. Robin's eyes welled with tears. She tried to hold back. Janelle stared straight ahead, her expression stoic, but inside her chest, her heart was racing. The judge paused, turning a page of his notebook. Upon due consideration of the arguments made, the evidence submitted, and the relevant statutes, this court holds the silence hung, agonizing. The Browns steeled themselves, their whole future condensed into one moment. That the state has failed to show criminal activity, warranting a conviction. Thus, this case is dismissed. The courtroom exploded. Gasps, screams, cheers, and groans swirled through the room in a frenzied maelstrom of sound. Supporters sprang to their feet, cheering and sobbing, calling out the Browns' names. Protesters cursed, some storming out of the room in rage. Reporters were on the move, shouting as they called in the developing news. Kody Brown acquitted. Case dismissed. The wives broke into tears, clutching each other in relief. Christine sobbed openly, burying her face in her hands. Robin collapsed against Kody's shoulder, whispering, "We're free." Mary and Janelle exchanged a glance. Two women who rarely saw eye to eye, yet in that moment, united in gratitude. Kody breathed for the first time in years. He gazed up at the judge, his voice shaking but firm. "Thank you, Your Honor." The judge held up a hand for silence. This decision doesn't legalize polygamy. It doesn't alter the law, but it does find that this court cannot sanction people for consenting relationships if no fraud or abuse has been established. This decision is not a recommendation, but a finding of boundaries. Court is adjourned. The gavel came down, and like that, it was done. The Browns stood amidst a crowd of flashing cameras. There were reporters everywhere, thrusting microphones into their faces. "Kody, how are you feeling today? Do you feel that this is a victory for polygamy? What is next for your family?" Kody held up a hand, his wives crowding around him, his voice firm, supported by the rush of adrenaline at their triumph. "This wasn't ever about winning or losing. This was about fighting for our family. We are not criminals. We are merely people who love one another." And today, the court acknowledged it. Outside, the crowd erupted in cheers as the Browns emerged from the courthouse steps. Fans screamed with delight, holding up signs that said "Love wins" and "Family freedom." Protesters, angry at the ruling, yelled back, their slogans mingling in a cacophony of sound. Police maintained the two groups apart, but the separation was real. That evening, the verdict was the top story on every news show. Some anchors presented it as a victory of personal freedom. "This is a victory for the right to choose how to live," one intoned. Others cautioned it was a slippery slope. Today, the Browns go free. Tomorrow will the floodgates open. The country was divided, as it had been during the trial, but now the arguments had greater sense of urgency. For the Browns, the relief was ubiquitous. In their own home, they hugged their children in the living room. The little ones threw themselves into the arms of their parents, hugging tightly, smiling faces even though they didn't quite get the seriousness of what had occurred. The older children, who had suffered the whispers and the stares in school, smiled proudly for the first time. Their family wasn't broken. They had made it through. Christine giggled through her tears, embracing her daughters. "We did it," she breathed. Janelle finally allowed herself to let go, collapsing into the couch, as if the world's weight had finally been removed. Mary, soft-spoken as ever, gave herself a small smile, though the tension of the trial was still etched in her eyes. Robin held on to Kody, mouthing prayers of thankfulness under her breath. Kody sat at the center of it all, his arms around whoever had leaned in closest. For years he'd borne the weight of being the one to lead this family through the scrutiny, the criticism, and the doubt. And now, despite being weary, he felt a surge of pride. They'd told their truth. They'd stood up to the law, and they'd walked away free. But even in triumph, the Browns knew the war was not yet won. The law remained unchanged. Polygamy was still outlawed on paper. They had been let off this time. But others in their position may not be so fortunate. And outside the walls of their home, the world was still divided, some praising their bravery, some honing their disdain. The consequences resonated far beyond the Browns' family room. Quietly practicing plural marriage families sat with tears in their eyes watching the news. Some were encouraged, hoping they could live more openly. Others were apprehensive, knowing the law was still not on their side. The Browns had won, but the war over polygamy in America was far from over. Kody understood that as well. Being with his wives that evening, he spoke quietly but firmly. "This wasn't about us. People will read about this case for years. Some will read it as hope. Some will read it as threat. But they'll read it. And perhaps that's what matters most. That we did not hide." The wives nodded, their faces tired but determined. They had been to hell and back together. They had watched the country divide along the lines of their lives. They had been judged, ridiculed, and misinterpreted. But they had also been heard, seen, and at least for the moment, validated. The cameras departed, protesters headed home, and reporters went on to the next story. But for the Browns, the trial was forever seared into their existence. It wasn't just a court case. It was a test of faith, a family of perseverance. And while scars lingered, they had shown themselves one thing, that no matter how splintered the world might become, their family was irrevocable. As Kody tucked his youngest into bed that evening, the child inquired innocently, "Daddy, are we safe now?" Kody hesitated, his throat constricting, and kissed the child's forehead. "Yes," he whispered. "For tonight we're safe." And as the house finally grew quiet, the Browns gave themselves a moment of peace, knowing tomorrow would bring a new problems, new arguments, new scrutiny. But tonight they had prevailed. Tonight they were safe. And that was enough for this family.